C'est le moment tant attendu où nous allons entendre nos auteurs fabuleux. I wish to take a moment to welcome those of us, or those of our colleagues, I should say, who are joining us from online, because we're moving into another format, which is a hybrid webinar and a lunch. Pour ceux qui se joignent à nous, sachez que le lunch ici est plutôt énergisé et très intéressant. On a 6 auteurs à vous présenter et sachez aussi qu'aujourd'hui, exceptionnellement, nous recourons à un modèle de règles non chatting. So no chatting rule. This is an open forum dans un effort pour donner la chance à nos auteurs de se faire connaître. And I should also say that we are recording this session, which will be put up on the website at some point. Again, in an effort to give our distinguished guests more visibility. C'est une occasion aussi, parce que je sais qu'on a plusieurs auteurs accomplis dans l'audience et plusieurs qui voudront le devenir, ou sont en devenir, d'utiliser cette occasion pour apprendre. I wish also to thank that I would be remiss not to have done so, Beechwood Bookstore, who again, because they have been with us for some time, have graciously agreed to be here with us today. So thank you for helping us do this event. Alors, sans plus tarder, je passe la parole à Yann Ferguson qui va prendre la relève de cet événement à partir d'ici. Merci.
Merci, Roxanne. I think we have an exceptional lineup of creative people today. They'll each have 8 minutes, and I'll be keeping time. With 2 minute and 1 minute warning. And hold your questions till the end. And we hope there will be enough time for your questions. So our first speaker will be Brian Buckley, who will talk about Tim's story.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. So, yes, it's a pleasure. D'abord, merci Roxanne et Ian pour cette très aimable introduction. Pour ma part, je tiens à vous remercier, ainsi que Ian, les autres membres du conseil d'administration de l'ambassade Canada et les amis de Book on Beechwood pour tout le travail que vous avez fait, que vous avez réalisé pour organiser cette séance aujourd'hui. C'est un vrai plaisir d'être ici parmi tant de visages amicaux et familiers, tous témoignant de l'importance et la croissance de l'organisation. Ian mentioned that he had these cards with warning signs on them, but he didn't tell you that just behind me here, and I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's a big hook, and it's attached to a very long staff. And he gently informed me that if I go past the 8 minutes, that hook is going to be used to help me to get to the exit. So I've worked with Ian before, and I know he's a man of his word. So without any further ado, I'm going to launch into my presentation. Just a few biographical notes. I joined the old External Affairs in 1967 and spent 32 years in the service. My career was evenly divided between headquarters and field assignments in the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. And I've got very fond memories of La Carrière and the times I spent in it. The work was always interesting. The people were amicable and friendly and bright, which was always very nice. And the change of pace was good. The family and I seemed to adapt quite well to moving around quite often. All that said, I've always had a sort of lingering interest in the dreaming spires of academia. And when an opportunity came up for the end of my career to spend a year at Dalhousie, basically free to pursue whatever I wanted to do, I grabbed it. So I left. I went for 1 year, stayed in Dalhousie for 3, and then after that we came back to Ottawa on my way to Mariano. My book is called Tim's Story, a Canadian Airman in World War II, and it really began as an exercise in family history. The person at the center of the tale is a gentleman by the name of Tim Carlin, my wife's late uncle, who joined the RCAF in just as the Second World War broke out with his younger brother Peter. Everyone in the family knew that Tim had had a very adventurous war, but the details had gotten a little fuzzy over the years and a little faded with time. I had done a sort of a research monograph on an uncle of mine who had fought in World War I, and I thought it would be an interesting and intriguing thing to do the same sort of thing for Tim if I could. So that was the genesis of it. But as I got into the research material and understood what I was dealing with, I gradually realized that I was really talking about the experience of a whole generation of young Canadians who went off to fight in the war. And I began to think that Tim's life was unique. All of our lives are unique, that's a given. But the experiences that he had were paralleled in the lives of many tens of thousands of others. So I thought that if I could somehow weave their experiences into the lattice of Tim's war, then I could also tell a better story and also honor those people whose stories never have been told and never will be. So I raised my ambitions somewhat. I set a higher target, and I thought it was worthwhile because these people went out and performed for us, even if we sometimes forget it. It was really a colossal achievement. They took on and they defeated one of the great existential threats of the 20th century. And had it gone otherwise, we wouldn't be having this great pleasant lunch today, I'm quite sure. The basic facts of Tim's war are both tragic and inspirational. In 1941, with his brother Peter, he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was posted overseas in March 1942, served as a navigator on a Halifax bomber with the RAF's 405 Squadron, which was attached to Bomber Command. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal for gallantry in November of 1942 for his part in bringing his wounded, crippled bomber back safely to base and saving the lives of his own life and that of the crew. A few months later, he was shot down and wounded over Germany, spent 26 months in prisoner of war camps, made 3 escape attempts, survived the forced marches of 1945, and returned to Canada, only to die of a war-related illness in 1950, 3 weeks short of his 33rd birthday. Through all of this turmoil, Tim never seems to have lost his courage or his self-possession. I was so taken with this aspect of the story that I devote the last chapter of the book really to an examination of courage, what it is and what it isn't. And I can't claim that I've come up with any radical new insights, except maybe the general observation that it's more important to follow the example than it is to explain the mystery. But what it did do was allow me to explore a few interesting intellectual highways and byways and the works of people that I might otherwise have set aside. Il y avait un facteur de plus supplémentaire qui m'a invité de poursuivre le projet. Tim était un anglophone de Montréal. Son pilote, Georges Chrétien, était franco-ontarien. Et quand Tim, Georges a vécu les mêmes expériences, il a été décoré pour sa galanterie. Il est rentré en sécurité au Canada à la fin de la guerre et les deux sont demeurés en contact jusqu'à la mort de Tim en 1950. Personnellement, j'étais très profondément touché par le partenariat de ces deux jeunes hommes, l'un anglophone et l'autre francophone, qui ont mis leur vie en jeu pour affronter un défi commun. Et pour moi, c'est un exemple puissant et réel de l'importance de cette relation fondamentale, plus élargie, entre nos communautés principales linguistiques, qui sous-tend une grande partie du succès de notre pays, que notre pays a connu. I actually had a first draft in hand before we left Halifax, but despite my best intentions, when we got back, it got pushed aside and it languished into my round to it drawer. You know, the one at the bottom there where you have the projects that you expect to get to at some point. And along came the pandemic, and I received the same intimations of mortality that we all did. And while I won't say there is much good about the COVID-19 pandemic, it did bring home to me that I wasn't here forever. And if I ever did expect to complete this project, I should get on with it. So it became sort of my my COVID project. Aha. I'm afraid of that book. So a long story short, I researched a bunch of news sources and got access to some important additional primary source material and substantially rewrote the text. And that's the story behind the story. One last comment. I published other works in the past, but Tim's story was my first venture into print-on-demand self-publishing. I was skeptical of the project at first, but I must say that Friesen Press proved to be a great partner. The process does entail a certain amount of work and a willingness to learn a few new tricks, which for us old dogs is not always that simple. But they were friendly, confident, and helpful. And if there's anyone out there with a story that they really want to see in print, but doesn't want to wait for 6 months or a year before some publisher makes up their mind to do it, by all means, give me a call and I will happily share my experiences with you. Merci à tous. Thank you for braving the weather today and coming out.
Yes, Friesen Press, great Manitoba success story in printing and publishing. I think it's just celebrated their centenary. Thank you, Brian. Our next speaker sera Claire Poulin et son roman Arthabasca, le croisé des destins.
Bonjour, good afternoon. Merci d'être là. Ça fait vraiment plaisir après un temps aussi long à la maison ou ailleurs, mais sans les ex-collègues. Alors, ça fait vraiment chaud au cœur de pouvoir tous vous retrouver, enfin, certains d'entre vous. Merci d'être là. Et merci à Yann pour avoir orchestré, je devrais dire, ce programme des auteurs. Alors, c'est vraiment bien apprécié. Je ne serai pas longue parce que mon écrit, c'est un roman. Alors, un roman, il faut que ça reste un petit peu mystérieux, hein? Il ne faut pas tout dire, il faut qu'on suscite l'envie de le lire. Alors, je vais plutôt vous expliquer comment je suis arrivée à écrire un roman. Bon, alors, on est en 2005, quand je commence. Hein? 2005, ça fait quand même assez longtemps. Je terminais mon travail comme directrice générale des affaires internationales et interparlementaires au Parlement du Canada. J'avais été aussi chef adjoint pendant ces 4 années là-bas. Et je voulais revenir au ministère des Affaires étrangères. Alors, on m'a accordé un congé sabbatique. Alors, Claire Poulin, en congé sabbatique, ça ne peut pas rester à rien faire. Hein? Alors, le voyage, ça m'intéresse beaucoup, c'est une de mes passions. Mais mon conjoint, Gaston, qui est là d'ailleurs, travaillait. Alors, faire des voyages sans Gaston, c'est pas la même chose. Alors, j'ai décidé d'aller vers ma deuxième passion, qui était l'écriture. Et j'ai décidé d'écrire un roman. Alors, un roman, c'est pas ma vie, c'est pas mes mémoires, c'est vraiment quelque chose d'inventé, mais à partir de personnes qui m'ont inspirée. Alors, je dois dire que c'est un peu complexe parce qu'on doit d'abord, quand on se met à écrire un roman, si jamais un jour ça vous intéresse d'en écrire un ou ça vous tente, il faut d'abord faire un plan. Il faut vraiment camper son action, camper ses personnages. À quelle époque? Est-ce qu'on écrit au je, au il, à quelle personne? Alors, quelle va être l'action? Il faut qu'il y ait beaucoup d'actions, des rebondissements et tout ça. Alors, il faut vraiment tout décider ça et c'est pas évident. Alors, j'avais déjà tout fait ça. Je me suis inspirée aussi de 2 personnes près de moi, entre autres le père de ma belle-sœur, qui est française, qui habite le sud de la France, qui est d'ailleurs décédé il y a environ 1 mois. Alors, son père était un personnage de roman pour moi. C'est quelqu'un qui a été cuisinier au Negresco sur la Côte d'Azur, qui a eu beaucoup d'argent, qui en a beaucoup perdu aussi. Il jouait hein, au casino, tout ça, alors il a perdu tout son avoir. Et la belle maison où la belle-sœur habite, mais en fait, ils habitent dans le rez-de-chaussée, le sous-sol quasiment de cette spacieuse maison qui a été obligée d'être vendue, liquidée, parce qu'il avait trop de dettes. Alors, je ne vous dis pas que mon roman, c'est ça, mais c'est inspiré de cette histoire, de cette personne qui a vraiment connu beaucoup de péripéties. Mon deuxième personnage est féminin, et là, on se rapproche un peu plus du Canada. Alors, c'est ma mère. Ma mère était maîtresse d'école dans un milieu rural au Québec. Et si vous connaissez la région de Victoriaville-Arthabasca, il y a des écoles de rang. Il y en a une, entre autres, qui est encore un musée, l'école du rang des Saint-Chico. Alors, si un jour vous passez par là, elle existe toujours. Et ça m'a inspiré pour cette portion-là de mon roman. Mais comment dirais-je, ça m'a pris beaucoup de recherche, hein, parce que le sud de la France, Grasse, Cannes, Saint-Paul-de-Vence, entre autres, j'en parle beaucoup, Nice, tout ce qui se passe dans ces coins-là, il a fallu le mettre de manière romancée dans mon écrit. La même chose au Canada, c'est très lié à des choses historiques de l'endroit où ça se passe. Alors, ça se passe justement un petit peu avant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, pendant et après. Alors, il faut vraiment que ce soit à cette époque-là que ça se déroule. Alors, vous comprenez qu'il y a beaucoup de recherches derrière un petit roman comme ça. Le procédé a été interrompu parce que je suis revenue au ministère des Affaires étrangères, je n'avais pas terminé. Et là, je m'ai amené ma petite disquette. À l'époque, c'était sur une petite disquette. Je me suis dit, quand j'aurai du temps de lire, je retournerai à mon roman. Eh bien, croyez-le ou pas, je n'ai jamais pu réécrire pendant que j'étais en poste. Alors, mes 3 postes d'ambassadeur, et puis aussi, j'ai eu un dossier que j'ai beaucoup aimé, de tous les dossiers du ministère, je crois que c'en est un qui était très positif, celui de faire la promotion de l'éducation internationale pour le Canada. Alors, ça m'a beaucoup pris, et finalement, je n'ai pas écrit. Alors, c'est seulement à la retraite, il y a quelques années, que j'ai décidé de reprendre le crayon. Et là, je m'y suis remise. Et après, il y a une autre étape, c'est de trouver un éditeur. Et alors là, probablement que les collègues qui ont écrit savent de quoi je parle. Et surtout pour un roman, c'est pas évident de trouver un éditeur. Parce que au deuxième roman, peut-être, parce que là, on est connu. Mais au premier, Alors, j'ai fait affaire avec 7 éditeurs différents au Canada. Et il y a une seule, croyez-le ou pas, une seule maison d'édition qui a venu me répondre. Et parce que je la connaissais. Parce que quand j'ai étudié en lettres françaises à l'Université de Montréal, j'ai fait de la correction des preuves pour cette maison d'édition. J'ai même corrigé un dictionnaire, juste pour vous dire. Alors, le président me connaissait et il a donné mon roman à lire à quelqu'un. Et cette personne a daigné me rappeler. Alors, on m'a dit, et là, c'est très spécial parce que ça en dit beaucoup, on m'a dit qu'il n'y avait pas assez de violence dans mon roman. Les lecteurs d'aujourd'hui, là, ils veulent des mitraillettes, des meurtres, comme dans Agatha Christie. C'est bien écrit. Mais moi, mon roman, il n'y a pas de violence. Il y a quelques scènes, il y a beaucoup de, comment dirais-je, de tragédies. Il y a des rebondissements, mais il n'y a pas de violence. Alors, ils m'ont dit qu'ils étaient restés sur leur faim lorsque mon protagoniste masculin se fait couper un doigt. Bon, il y a toute une scène, la bagarre, ils s'engueulent, bon, je ne dirai pas tout, mais il se fait couper un doigt. Et là, ils m'ont dit, on est resté sur notre faim. Vous auriez dû poursuivre dans cette lignée-là ou avoir plus de choses comme ça dans votre roman. Alors, ils m'ont même donné du temps, ils m'ont dit, vous pouvez continuer à travailler, puis on va vous reprendre. J'ai dit non, moi, mon roman, il n'y a pas de violence. Alors, j'ai gardé mon roman et je suis allée voir un éditeur en France qui, lui, a décidé de le publier. Alors, malheureusement, je suis plus vendue en France qu'au Québec ou qu'au Canada, mais quand même. Et je dois dire que l'éditeur est très bien. Ils ont même accepté de mettre une de mes aquarelles sur la page couverture. Alors, si vous regardez la belle petite feuille d'érable bleue, c'est mon œuvre et c'est le Canada. Alors voilà, je n'en dis pas plus. J'espère que j'ai suscité votre intérêt. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Claire. Et j'allais dire aussi, Pour les gens en ligne, if you want to ask a question, if we have time for questions, use the Q&A function, and we'll try and take that into account. Thank you, Claire. And our next speaker will be Gar Party.
Thank you. And, I guess leaving or giving us only 8 minutes for foreign service officers. Tough standard. All of us, I guess. But in any event, my subject is a large one, and all the more reasons for you to go to the back of the room and pick up a copy, because if you have trouble sleeping, it may help you in that respect. Anyway, the nuclear subject, of course, has been with me. I was born actually before the nuclear age began, and I can even vaguely remember the stories that came out in 1945 about the bombs in Japan. Fast forwarding from that, in that period, and I wasn't even a Canadian in those days, but then a man by the name of Mackenzie King and the Prime Minister of the UK decided that Newfoundland should not be left alone in the middle of the North Atlantic, but they engineered a union with Canada, and eventually I ended up as a member of the Foreign Service. But before that, I was working in Goose Bay initially in 1959, working with their meteorological service in Canada. And job in Goose Bay was it was a major military base, largely about 10,000 Americans there, aircraft, one thing another. And we were providing weather services for the Strategic Air Command at that base. And one day in late spring of 59, we were all awarded to go to the edge of the base on the part of the runway. There was a forest fire burning across Labrador, and we were all brought into service here to try to put out that fire. And we were all lining up with axes and shovels and one thing and another. And then eventually somebody came up and says, "Boys, you got to do more than that." And we said, "Why?" And he said, "Look at those bunkers over there." And we said, "What's in those?" And he said, "There's atomic bombs in those bunkers in Goose Bay." Needless to say, it hastened our work, but nature intervened and sent a nice rain shower and that put out the fire. And we went to the nearest bar and really unsober yourself. But the issue, of course, has been with us since 45, or that's when it was most dramatically introduced, I think, to world international politics. And during the whole period that I've been in the Foreign Service, in one way or another, I've been associated with the issue in terms of how Canada's been dealing with the issue. Of course, our own history on the issue is a checkered one. We were part of the Manhattan Project, along with the Brits and the Americans in terms of the development of the first bombs that were used in Japan. And but after the war, the Americans turned in on themselves and decided that they were going to keep these secrets to themselves. And we went our own way, and the Brits went their own way as well. We decided that maybe the peaceful uses of nuclear energy was the way to go. And we did so, and stuck to that, even though the American nuclear umbrella, of course, has provided great protection for us, in both in terms of the NATO arrangements and then NORAD itself. But we have also, during that whole period, tried to play a role internationally in terms of trying to create some of the international agreements that are necessary, in effect, for one. I guess the first project was to try to eliminate the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, and the 1963 agreement there was a good one. And then in 1970, of course, there was the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which carried within it a mandate for the international community to seek the elimination of all nuclear weapons. And really, that objective has never been fulfilled in any effective way, even though in recent years there's been 2 additional treaties that have been added to the inventory. One was in '96, when there was in effect an agreement, and it's had widespread support in the world, and that was to eliminate all testing of nuclear weapons, even though using testing underground. And that the problem with that particular treaty, 8 of the initial countries that were involved in it have refused to sign the treaty, and as a result of that, the treaty has not been come into force. A second treaty, in just a couple of years ago, actually in 2021, calls specifically for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And that treaty is at overwhelming support within the UN system, but the United States and most of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have objected to the treaty, and that's why that treaty, while it's in force, but yet it's not been acted upon in any effective way because of those 5 countries. Canada has not voted that treaty. For that treaty, basically we sided with the Americans and all of our nuclear partners in saying this was not the time for the elimination of nuclear weapons. In my book, I take a different view. I think the time is opportune now to restart the efforts that were quite active in the 70s and the 80s to see the elimination of nuclear weapons. And we're within just about 20 years from now, there will be 100 years as a centenary of the atomic age, of course, which came into existence in 1945. And I see 2045 as being an objective that the world should work towards here in terms of see the elimination of those weapons. Some of you may be old enough to remember a American singer back in the late 60s and the early 50s, Tom Lehrer, wonderful singer, and he wrote some of the best social commentaries on the world around us. And one of his songs, of course, is the one that really is the anthem for the nuclear age. And Tom, in 1959, wrote, we will all go together when we go, what a comforting fact that is to know, universal bereavement and inspiring achievement. Yes, we'll all go together and we go. And that remains as the anthem for the nuclear age. And in effect, it's all the more reason for us to get to work on this one. And I would hope that the book will contribute to that effort in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Gar. And now I'd like to invite Carole Rougeau to take the microphone to talk about her book, Triple Sex. I forgot the rest.
Thank you. Spouses don't get to take center stage often, so I'm suck in the marrow with this baby. I am singing, I'm dancing, the 8 minutes are iffy. So the first thing I want to address is there sex in this book? You would think yes. I'm married to a guy called John Holmes, after all. But given the hours you guys catch, alas, no. But I will say this, there was a time when John came home all excited when we were in Jordan, and he said, honey, I've been chosen to be ambassador to Iraq. And in my loving, supportive way, I said, what are you, nuts? Like, from a list of one? Like, is there a lineup outside the Lester Pearson's building saying, there's me, I'm going to Iraq? So I tried everything to talk him out of going. Gentle persuasion, I thought good arguments. And finally, in desperation, I said, John, if you go to Iraq, there will be no sex for 1 year. I was perimenopausal, so that meant twice, basically. If you want to know how it unfolded, you'll have to find the book. On our wedding night, John whispered in my ear, Darling, I'll never make us rich. And man, did he keep that promise. But I'm going to show you the world. And he did. And I'm eternally grateful to him for that. Because along the way, we met extraordinary people. We lived through some incredible times. And I felt compelled to write about those. Initially, for our 2 kids, because we pulled them from pillar to post. And I felt that they should have a written history of what our lives had been. I had this fantasy that 100 years from now, some great grandchild would find, you know, the manuscript tied up in twine, and we get to know what, you know, his ancestors had lived through. Of course, the kids then told me they don't want children, so that screwed up that idea. I dipped my toe in the water. I wrote one chapter on Barbados, ending it with a recipe. There are 6 chapters, 6 recipes. And I sent it to Rachel Manley, who is an illustrious writer and a very good friend of mine. I'd written a story about her and Michael Manley, the former Prime Minister of Jamaica, in it. And I said, Ray, what do you think? Did I capture him well? And she sent that story to her brother in Jamaica, and he wrote her and said, Ray, it's the best firsthand commentary on Dad that I've ever read. And without telling me, Rachel sent it to her literary agent in London. He wrote to me and he said, I like your style, keep going. And that encouraged me. So I wrote the manuscript. And then Rachel, again, sent it to the vice president of Penguin Random House Canada, who again wrote to me. A lot of writing, no concrete, you know, feedback, but she said, love your style, it's really good. We only deal with known authors. And at that point, I said to John, it's not meant to be. It's not meant to be published. And by the way, just the act of doing it, hearing on this is good enough. I mean, it's important. And I'll tell you why I think that is after. And John said, no freaking way. This is going to be published. And he pursued it. And thank you, my darling. It was published. I would say that you should all write a memoir, because it's not just what we saw, what we experienced, but how it shaped us as adults. And in reflecting on that, as I wrote the book, I realized that although I'd always seen myself as this grand adventurous, bravely going off into the world, I was in fact escaping. I was leaving from rather than going to. And I think there's a lot of escape artists in the room. I had an unhappy childhood, and you know, I just wanted to go out. The other thing that really struck me is this is not going to work with a partner unless you're a team. And frankly, I could not have found a better partner to do this with. It was a hell of a ride and so much fun. And I think that comes through in the book. The other thing that really surprised me is I've gotten feedback from young women. And, you know, I really grappled with being the wife of. In fact, I hated it. I didn't define myself that way. And the young women that wrote to me said, but it's a feminist manifesto. And I'm like, what? And I said, yeah, you were able to carve your own route. You were able to define it in your own way. And that's feminism. And that was great to hear and a surprise to me. So on that note, I will just end with a little snippet of a story. I won't read it because I'll go over my 8 minutes. Stick with me here. Ghana, second posting. About to go to a dinner hosted by American diplomats. John says, honey, you're going to be sitting next to the deputy foreign minister. He's a hard nut to crack. I've been trying to get meetings with him, and he's not responding. Running up, trying him, whatever. And I thought, wow, like, can I really help? I'll try. So I go to the dinner, I'm sitting down next to this guy. And he turns out to be an Oxford grad with a very plummy accent. And contrary to most Guineans we met who were warm and lovely, he was like, you know, obviously found wrong-inducing. Every sort of conversational tennis ball I launched into his court just fell flat, didn't bounce back. So finally, I just started talking to the person next to me. And along the way, I feel a tug on my shoulder. And this plummy accent says, do say, what is the national day of Canada? And I kind of frowned at her and I said, you're looking at it, honey. And then I thought, Jesus, no. Anyways, there was a stunned silence. John is sort of glaring at me. And then here is Greg starts laughing and couldn't stop. And the next thing I know, he's offering to pick me up and bring me to some food markets, and we became great buddies. And I introduced him to John. And so, yeah, you could make a difference. And so that's it. I'm so honored to be here tonight. Thank you for coming. Merci bien.
Et maintenant, je vais appeler Jean Dion et sa partenaire, Lucie. Ils vont nous parler de leur livre Diplomate en péril, suivi de chroniques peu diplomatiques.
Alors, bonjour à tout le monde. Hello everyone. Merci à Ambassade Canada et aux organisateurs pour cet événement et pour leur dévouement. Nous félicitons tous les auteurs pour leur ténacité et leur originalité dans leur sujet. Finalement, un merci très particulier à Robin Hyham pour son travail et ses encouragements. Écrire un livre, c'est courir un véritable marathon. Alors, je me tiens au texte que Jean-Yves m'a suggéré.
Was kind of a briefing book. Selon les thèmes choisis, le genre et l'originalité de notre livre. Alors, c'est un essai sur le service extérieur canadien. Les échecs répétés de notre diplomatie au cours des dernières années ne sont pas tout simplement la situation géopolitique du Canada, mais bien aux décisions qui ont affaibli la marge de manœuvre d'affaires mondiales, sa puissance douce et de ses diplomates. Notre diplomatie a du plomb dans l'aile et c'est en grande partie à la suite d'un lent détricotage de son service extérieur. Notre essai décortique les raisons qui minent l'influence de la diplomatie canadienne et explique pourquoi notre pays ne joue plus le rôle qu'il avait auparavant sur la scène internationale. Notre essai fait un état des lieux du système diplomatique canadien, son histoire, ses particularités. C'est dans un contexte fédéral, évidemment, le recrutement des agents et le profil des candidats recherchés. Ensuite, il élabore sur la formation, les tâches et les outils de travail. Le texte expose également les notions du professionnalisme du métier, son bien-être et le rôle moteur de la syndicalisation et de la lutte pour ses acquis. Finalement, nous dressons le portrait des diverses problématiques du système, les échecs et les victoires des agents. Tout ceci est mis dans un contexte évolutif rapide de notre métier. Les coupes budgétaires à répétition et les gouvernements successifs ont dévalué graduellement les conditions de vie à l'étranger, des agents tant au niveau personnel que professionnel. Nous posons alors les questions existentielles qui sous-tendent le renouvellement de l'institution du service extérieur, qui a été jusqu'ici le fer de lance de toute politique étrangère et un formidable outil de mise en œuvre payé par nos impôts. Nous suggérons des pistes pour déverrouiller un système bloqué dans lequel nos agents sont tenus enferrés depuis des décennies. Oups, petite mise en garde ici. Cette présentation n'est pas, mais vraiment pas, un pitch de vente de la société McKinsey. Nous sommes actuellement dans un passage à vide et nous devons réfléchir à ce que nous ferons de notre diplomatie au 21e siècle. La parole nous appartient. Les autres parties de notre livre contiennent plus de 80 courts récits captivants ou piquants, racontant le travail et la vie d'expatriation d'un agent et de sa famille. Nous mettons en évidence des aventures amusantes, cocasses ou tristes d'un vécu sur 3 continents, durant une période de plus de 30 ans. En lisant ce livre, vos yeux et votre imagination voyageront. Par exemple, vous serez témoin de la prise d'otages non préméditée sur le train Lufthansa entre Bonn et Francfort. Vous visualiserez les cabrioles d'Hugo, un petit chimpanzé lors de réception de missions commerciales à Yaoundé.
et vous vous surprendrez des avances inconvenantes de Petit Pierre, dit Monsieur Haïti, héros burlesque du roman Les Comédiens, à Port-au-Prince, et vous serez les témoins privilégiés de présentations surréalistes de lettres de créance à des dictateurs de ce monde. Ces tableaux sont le sel du métier de la diplomatie. Des tableaux synthèses et une bibliographie importante complètent les 425 pages d'un livre que nous vendons à prix doux. Finalement, Diplomate en péril est le livre que Marcel aurait aimé écrire s'il avait été de ce monde en 2020. Nous sommes tout simplement les héritiers de son livre, Le diplomate canadien.
Alors, moi, je vais vous lire quelques réactions et commentaires que nous avons reçus suite à la publication du livre. Alors, pour vous éclairer sur le sujet, voici, je vais vous en lire quelques-uns. Alors, bien écrit, excellente recherche, très bien documentée. Alors, la recherche, là, c'est vraiment Jean-Yves. Je ne peux pas dire que j'ai participé à ça. Très bien documentée, où vos deux personnalités ressortent bien et avec une biographie pertinente. Alors, une autre ici, une contribution importante pour mieux comprendre le rôle de la diplomatie canadienne et les défis de sa pratique. Ensuite, une autre, je vous félicite pour ce précieux apport au débat entourant la triste situation dans laquelle se trouve ce ministère auquel nous avons consacré 35 ans de nos vies et qui est inexorablement dans une triste dérive. Votre intéressante deuxième partie, chronique peu diplomatique, vient appuyer de façon magistrale la première et faisant toute une démonstration, sans le dire, du pourquoi d'un service extérieur professionnel. Un autre commentaire. Promoteur des valeurs canadiennes, ils, en parlant des auteurs, vous feront aimer ce métier avec tous ses avantages et inconvénients. Votre document fait preuve de pragmatisme et par ses exemples concrets fait la preuve du métier unique en son genre. C'est un parcours. Pardon? Hein? On achève? OK. C'est un parcours qui ne s'improvise pas, mais qui s'acquiert avec l'expérience du terrain et la connaissance des politiques de nos gouvernements. En fait, on peut laisser tomber le restant des... On va conclure avec ça. L'inspiration ou la muse de ce livre, notre envie de faire un bilan, un dernier tour de piste sur cette vie et carrière unique où épouse et conjoint et enfants sont au premier rang des otages de ce métier. Sur une note plus personnelle, une grande frustration de devoir annuler une longue croisière en Asie du Sud-Est durant la pandémie pour souligner notre 50e anniversaire. Alors, c'est le résultat de...
Troisième pistolet.
Voilà.
Bon, merci, Lucie et Jean-Yves. Et maintenant, je fais mon dernier conférencier, our last writer, Gary Smith, for Ice War Diplomat, Hockey Meets Cold War Politics at the 1972 Summit Series.
Thanks, Ian, and félicitations to every author here. It's not an easy job, turning your thoughts and words into a full-fledged book. And marketing is another whole field entirely. I'm very happy to see that Carol has a leg up on us, the national dish of Canada, and triple sex to match on your book cover. So voila. Ice War Diplomat. I was lucky that this was a subject that ended up being one of the top 10 historical events in Canada in the 20th century, along with the flag, women's right to vote, Medicare, patriation of the Constitution, Vimy Ridge, and so on. The 5 words, Henderson has scored for Canada, is remembered by Canadians from coast to coast to coast. This country ground to a halt in September 1972. Children were put into assemblies, gymnasiums to watch on a small screen. Business stopped working. September 28th, Game 8 in Moscow. 34 seconds left to go. And as I say, Henderson has scored for Canada. 150 million Soviets watch this as well. Now, there over the years have been about 40 books written on the series, almost all of them from a Canadian point of view, the players, the coaches, the managers like Alan Eagleson. But nobody really got into the issue of the politics and the diplomacy of 1972 and the Cold War. We had Pierre Elliott Trudeau, first ever Prime Minister of Canada to visit the Soviet Union. 12 days, he covered the whole country. Alexei Kosygin comes back to Canada, he's booed everywhere. There are demos everywhere in Canada until he gets to Vancouver and he's invited out onto the ice, the Soviet flag flying, first time ever at an NHL game. And all of a sudden the light goes on for him. The way to get to Canada and Canadians is through hockey. Now, we've got Trudeau, we've got Kosygin. Leonid Brezhnev, the head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, is a great hockey fan. And we also have, in the Department of External Affairs, a guy called Ed Ritchie, Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, DM in today's lingo. He played for the Oxford Blues, passionate hockey fan. And the great diplomat, Robert Arthur Douglas Ford in Moscow. Between Ritchie and Ford, we had a huge juggernaut of diplomatic skill. And in writing a book, what's important? Timing, the ability to have creative juices, and also connections. So, why did I get to write this book? Because I was lucky to have been assigned to Moscow in 1971 in time for the Trudeau visit. I was lucky to be there when Kosygin came to Canada. I was lucky to have been there when the General Exchanges Agreement was signed, which included sportsmen. I was lucky to have been assigned to deal with exchanges. I knew how to play hockey. I played for the Moscow Maple Leafs. And all those things came together. I got involved in the negotiations for the series. I accompanied the Soviet team across Canada. I looked after Team Canada in Moscow. That was all luck, being in the right place at the right time for an event that turned out to be of great historic significance in Canada. Now, timing. Le moment. 50th anniversary of the Summit Series was coming up last year. The media and the government and the public were interested in what went on. So that became a very important aspect when you go to speak with publishers and others. Timing. The Cold War. Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th was both a good thing and a bad thing for me. A bad thing for Ukraine, a bad thing in the sense that the Canadian government went to ground on all things Russian. But it was a good thing in that it took the focus off China. You know, we had had a focus on China with the two Michaels for about 3 years. And the focus all of a sudden shifted onto Russia. And here I was writing a book about the politics and diplomacy of Russia. So that immediately attracted media attention. Creative juices. How do you write a book? Well, I started off with Declassified, thanks to Robin Hyam, and a second book that he put together, mentioned in dispatches, not mentioned in dispatches, small 2,000, 3,000 word stories. So I wrote 3 of those. It got me into the mood. Someone has mentioned COVID. COVID grounded everybody. My wife passed away, my dog passed away. I had lots of time on my hands because you need time to write, to turn 2,000 or 3,000 words into 120,000 words that you need for a book. Also, the issue of connections. You need connections. How do you get your book published? I found that I had a journalist friend. I went to him with my first chapter. He said, "This is pretty good, Gary. I'm going to put you in touch with my literary agent in Toronto." They looked at it. They said, "We're going to sign you up as a client." They went out and they do all the negotiating with publishing companies. You don't have to be involved in any of that legwork. And you've also escaped what's called the sludge pile. The sludge pile is when you just send it into publishers and it piles up and they get to it when they want to. And they always tell you, if you don't hear from us in 6 months, you're not going to hear from us. So you wait and you wait and wait, and then you get a no answer, and then you start all over again. So I was lucky to get an agent, signed a nice contract. I got an advance. They also signed a contract with an American company to do an audiobook. And again, luck came into play because 2 Canadian film companies decided that they wanted to have a documentary film about this great historic event. And they were looking to tell the story from a different point of view, not from the player's point of view, which had been told many times, but from a diplomatic political point of view. And so they came to me. I had only written 3 chapters at the time, but they said, "We want to take your book and make it the basis for this documentary film." And so I then had not only a literary agent in Toronto, but a film agent. And the film agent negotiated a contract, and I was able to be part of the text for the film, the screenplay. Fortunate to travel to Moscow in 2021 before the war to do filming. And it's very important when you're writing a historical piece about something that happened 50 years ago, people always say, "Well, what about today?" So I was lucky to have been back to Moscow. I had been back 5 years ago with members of Team Canada. A guy called Putin had received them at the time. So the fact that I could bring to the table the history of 50 years ago, but also updating it to today's world so that I could talk about what does this invasion mean or not mean. The downside to the publicity was that the Canadian government did not really go to bat for this book in the United States in particular. The Canadian Embassy gave it a wide berth, but the Canada Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center stepped up, and the Canadian American Business Council stepped up. So that was a good thing, and that's helped sales in the United States. Now, this film, if you have a film, and it's sort of incredible that my book got involved with a film, but when you go to a film, you get a large audience. People are interested in the film, and therefore when you sell your book there, you already have a select audience. People are already engaged in the subject matter. So that helps. And let me just mention that the film is going to be shown again in Ottawa at the Bytown Theatre on February the 22nd. And all proceeds from the ticket sales and all book royalties will go to the AMCAN and PASO scholarship for an Indigenous student. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. I'd like to invite all of the writers to come up for the question period. And if we don't get any questions, well, we'll just take a family picture. And if you do have a question, we've taped an X on the floor in front of the little round table, which is actually podium for the microphone. So if you have a question, just step up to the X, keep it short, and invite the writers all to come up. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I guess
Come on.
I should thank this group, not only for sharing their stories, but for following their inspiration, their creativity, their hard work, and their writing skills honed over doing many memos and messages over their career. So thank you all. Let's give them
Yeah,
a round of applause.
Question here, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I have a question. Does this work? For our party, I guess I'm the only person. You mentioned about nuclear weapons in Canada, and I guess I'm old enough to remember John Diefenbaker rejecting them, which was controversial because the previous government had accepted them. When he rejected them, his cabinet was split. His stand was supported by then Pierre Trudeau, who was not a minister or a politician, and Lloyd Axworthy. So when Lester Pearson became head of a minority government, he accepted the weapons, which I believe did come to Canada. So I don't think you mentioned the fact that at one point we did have nuclear weapons on our soil, aside from Newfoundland, which I guess wasn't part of Canada then.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. It's all in the book. Forgot one detail. Mr. Diefenbaker bought the Beaumark missile, but he refused to buy the weapon for which the Beaumark was intended to use, it was going to be used for. And then over time, of course, something called an ICBM came into use by the Russians, and suddenly the Beaumark it just faded, and we didn't need the weapons. But we still had weapons in Canada at North Bay for a period of time. I think it took about 10 years for those to be negotiated away. But during the same period, we were at access to nuclear weapons by the Canadian aircraft stationed at NATO in Europe, which was the other element that was involved here. But you know, it's, as I say, it's all in the book. It's a fascinating story. And what's even interesting, I came across, nobody remembers what Beaumark stands for. It's Boeing Michigan Aircraft Corporation, a total American organization. It was the companies that made the Beaumark missile, but then the weapons actually were, never did come to Canada. Well, they did. It came to North Bay, I think, essentially, I think, in the end. It was not a glorious period in Canadian history, I think, during that period. Mr. Diefenbaker swallowed his chewing gum and he accepted that for a brief period of time.
I think we've run out of time, but I'll ask Roxanne to come up and wrap up and make any announcements of upcoming events.
Excellent. Alors, écoutez, on a la chance que nos auteurs émérites ont accepté de rester avec nous quelques minutes de plus après ce lunch. Alors, je sais que vous êtes un peu shell-shocked by between triple sex and I don't know why we're so focused on that one. Abellez-vous, si vous voulez, de cette magnifique opportunité. Je voudrais aussi souligner qu'on a two really good events coming up. So on February 23rd, thanks to one of our new members, Alex Bukaliskis, she reached out to Eric Regoli, who is the European correspondent for the Globe and Mail, based in Italy, but who, as you know, with one of his colleagues, is covering the war in Ukraine. Just about one day before the anniversary of that war, he will be back in Italy, having spent a few weeks in Ukraine. And his title for his remarks are, "How will the war in Ukraine end?" This will be a webinar, so I'm sure there will be many of us who will be deeply interested in this. So keep an eye for this one coming up. And another one, equally as interesting, is on March 22nd. So ça va être un lunch ici en place, ainsi qu'un événement hybride en ligne. On a l'invité Goldie Hyder, pardonnez-moi, qui est le président de l'Association canadienne des affaires. And he will be speaking, I believe he has a chapter in one of the book that was published with some of our colleagues on Canada and the Indo-Pacific. So two great upcoming speakers for us, so that's wonderful. Et j'aimerais vous inviter à remercier Yann Ferg, nos auteurs, pour commencer. À remercier aussi Doug Secord, who is absolutely indispensable. Doug Secord. Doug Secord. Et Yann Ferguson, bien sûr, pour avoir avec nous. Et vous remercie aussi d'être venu en si grand nombre parce qu'on a commencé l'année 2023 de très bon pied. Alors, continuons et à très bientôt pour continuer ces lunchs. Et merci, bien sûr, à nos amis qui se sont joints à nous en ligne. Alors, à la prochaine. Au revoir.